Hello to everyone, welcome to a totally new podcast. The women of the Bible speak. The wisdom of 16 women. This is your Pastor Yadi. This is a special podcast for all you out there, women. First, I'm going to do an introduction, and the first episode we're going to talk about Sarah and Hagar, or Hagar. So, the introduction. This time will be different. It has to be. Keep that in mind. I often wonder what ran through the mind of the woman whose story is so powerful that it's woven through 3 of the Gospels. Yet we don't even know her name. We do have plenty of details, though, about just how dire her situation was. She suffered with bleeding for 12 long years. During that time, she must have had moments of complete despondence. In the time when she lived, this woman's affliction would have caused her not only physical pain, but also emotional isolation. According to the custom, she would not have been able to worship in a temple, and many would have considered her unclean. This likely would have meant she couldn't touch the people she loved most, her own family and friends. She may have been banned from visiting markets or seeking any real community connections. Mark tells us she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Mark 5:26. After so many years, so many dead ends, there must have been times when she thought this was how her story would end, with her hopeless and helpless. And yet, Mark goes on to tell us that she had heard the reports about Jesus. Mark 5:26. That was all it took for this disheartened woman to move forward. Words of Jesus' miracles had spread far and wide, and crowds often followed him, pushing in on every side, eager to hear his words and see if he could make a difference in their lives. The story gave root to the tiniest seed of hope in the woman's heart, a little green shoot that gave her the courage to take a big risk. Matthew maps out her strategy. She said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Matthew 9:21. So, that was the entirety of her plan. To get as close to Jesus as possible, touch his cloak, and receive a miracle. Bold. Remember, she likely wasn't even supposed to leave her home, and certainly not to be in a crowd where she would come in contact with other people. Not to mention Jesus himself. In her despair, she must have felt there were no other options left. When she finally got to where Jesus was, he was on his way to attend to the request of a powerful man who had begged him to save his dying daughter. As was often the case, this attracted spectators. Mark describes it as a great crowd that thronged about him. Mark 5:24. The ailing woman worked her way close enough to reach out to the miracle workers she'd heard so much about. Luke shares a powerful moment in the simplest language written. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Luke 8:44. Mark says immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Mark 5:29. That was it, but the story still wasn't over. Jesus knew what had happened. He looked to the crowd and asked his disciples who had touched him. You can almost hear the daughter in Peter's voice as he replies, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." Luke 8:45. Here's the thing. The woman knew that a man so powerful that mere contact with his garment would heal her, would certainly figure out whom he had healed. In both Mark and Luke, we're told that she went to Jesus in fear and trembling, falling down before him and telling him the whole truth. Was she afraid she was about to be exposed as an unclean rule breaker who shouldn't even been there? Jesus didn't berate her or humiliated her in front of the enormous crowd hanging on his every word. Only he could have known in that moment just how much she had suffered, or how she had courageously and humbly bundled all her hopes into the simple act of touching to them of his garment, the hem of his garment. So in all the Gospels accounts, he calls her daughter and tells her, "Your faith has made you well." Think for a moment how those words must have felt to someone likely living as an outcast. uttered as they were before the multitudes hanging on Jesus' every word, they would have constituted public acceptance. Though his power was clearly the source of her healing, and Jesus identified her faith as having activated her cure. After more than a decade of suffering, bad news, and financial ruin, she was finally free, healed in an instant, all because she dared reach out to him for help when every earthly avenue had ended in nothing but loss and despair. Throughout the Bible, women are at the center of some of the most critical events. They were bold and brave, finding courage in the moments when everything hung in the balance. They were voices of truth and reason. They were steady and creative, following God's directions when it didn't make sense by the world's standards. As we move forward in my other podcast, you'll hear their stories. Watch the women, as you listen, come alive as they dig into their life's significance. Individually, their accounts are powerful. Yet in this podcast, we will consider the women in pairs, finding the commonalities in their callings and challenges. Some of the women knew one another. Others were connected simply by a thread of common purpose, one that becomes more illuminated as we study the women side by side. I pray you'll find comfort and hope as you take this journey together. So as we move forward in our first session of the Women of the Bible Speak, we're going to talk about Sarah and Hagar, women of the covenants. I'm start with Sarah. Maybe write the scriptures down. It is all Genesis 11:27, chapter 12:20, chapter 16 1-6, chapter 17 15-19, chapter 18 1-15, chapter 20 1-18, chapter 21 1-13, chapter 23 1-9. So come with me. The facts of Sarah's life sounds like an adventure story, full of twists and turns. She was settled into a life when her husband suddenly announced they'd be appending everything they knew to move away out of their comfort zone. She managed a wealthy household with a very complicated blended family, and that's not all. She bore no child of her own, and even when God made her a specific promise, she laughed it off as impossible. How surprised she must have been when the wildly unthinkable finally came through for her. But oh, how far off track she'd already gotten by taking matters into her own hands. According to the Bible, Abraham twice denied being Sarah's husband to protect himself when a powerful ruler noticed just how beautiful she was and wanted her for himself. In the case involving Pharaoh, Sarah was already 65 years old. Think about how enduringly stunning her beauty must have been to draw so much attention, even as she was entering her golden years. Entering. That's the word. While many details about Sarah are unknown, we do know this. She was definitely skeptical of men in shining robes telling 90-year-old women they would have babies. So, who was she? Beyond these few tidbits, in reading the story of Abraham and Sarah, it's hard not to focus on Abraham. After all, he was the one who received the call from God. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Genesis 12, verse 1. It's the first hint we receive that his land, God will show him, the promised land, is going to play a crucial part in salvation history. But along with the promises to Abraham, God repeatedly makes clear that Sarah will be a key player, that she will be a mother of nations, kings of peoples shall come from her. Genesis 17:16. If Sarah objected to their journey, Scripture does not record it. In order to avoid a famine, she and Abraham journeyed from Ur to Haran, from Haran to Canaan, and then from Canaan to Egypt. Sarah supported her husband during the dispute with his nephew Lot, and during the subsequent battle with the 5 kings of Canaan. When he had to ride to Lot's rescue in Egypt, she was beautiful enough to attract Pharaoh's notice, which prompted Abraham to fudge the truth about she really was. If you're wondering why Abraham felt compelled to lie, remember that he was a refugee traveling through a foreign country. This was a period when powerful rulers could claim beautiful women simply because they wanted them. A protesting husband could pay with his life, and consequence of which Abraham would have been all too aware. Ultimately, the other man, moved by Sarah's beauty, rejected her when they realized she was married. The Lord himself directly intervened to protect her by sending plagues. In the case of Pharaoh, and by visiting Abimelech with a warning, Abraham's fear put Sarah in danger and also put other men in a position where they could have sinned against God. Abraham's deceit didn't help anyone, and his behavior tells us something about his character. He was sometimes fearful and weak. In retrospect, it is rather remarkable that God chose a man like Abraham to be the patriarch of his chosen people. But perhaps he did this in order to demonstrate his power through Abraham's foolishness. Excuse me. As Paul notes in 2 Corinthians 12:9, God's power is made perfect in weakness. And in 1 Corinthians 1:27, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. In any case, Abraham's weakness of character had a marked influence on his marriage, and I often wonder how Sarah felt being placed in potential danger because of his decisions. Sarah herself is voiceless until chapter 16 of the narrative, when for the first time she has something to say. Now, Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. Genesis 16, 1-2. It's almost as though Sarah were saying, "Okay, wait, hold up. I said nothing while you dragged us for hundreds of miles from Chaldea to Canaan to Egypt and back again. I said nothing while you talked about this covenant with God that you somehow think you have and the special promises. You say God has made you, but I've seen none of it happen. And if we're going to have an heir, then I'd better take matters into my own hands here." The first time we hear Sarah speak, she has a plan. But we know it's not God's plan. We know God is weaving an intricate story starring Isaac, but Sarah is still skeptical. Just the chapter before, God pledged to Abraham that the one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Genesis 15:14. God has shown him the glittering night sky, promising him that his descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky, uncountable. Abraham was all in. The minute God said jump, Abraham said, "How high?" But highly uncertain that any of this would come to pass. Sarah wanted evidence. She appears to him to have been the practical one in the relationship, not faithless, but not exactly trusting either. So she came up with a solution to what she saw as a problem of God's unfulfilled promise. Following ancient Near Eastern custom, Sarah hatched a plan to produce an heir, sending Abraham to go into her maid, Hagar, so she could obtain children through her. But as sometimes happens when we stop trusting God's plan and go our own way, things went terribly wrong. The minute Hagar successfully conceived, the relationship between the two women imploded. In the Bible, Sarah complains to Abraham, "I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me." Genesis 16:5. Hagar likely lorded her pregnancy over Sarah. Genesis 16:4. Translate to show us that Hagar considered Sarah a person of no standing because she was barren. So then, the far younger Hagar was only one bearing a child for Abraham, was the only. It might have been natural for Hagar to assume that her relationship with both Sarah and Abraham had changed. Her status had surely improved, and as the mother of Abraham's soul there, she had security for the future. So, what was Abraham's reaction to the news that his wife's no pregnant servant despised her? Did he urge calm? Did he try to hear both sides of his dispute? Not exactly. Abram said to his wife, "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." Genesis 16, verse 6. This is now the second time we see Abraham's acquiescence to his wife's wishes. When we know Sarah is in the wrong, their relationship comes into a sharper focus now, and it is a complicated one, marked by times when she speaks her mind and times when she silently follows his lead. In this instance, he attempts to restore peace in his relationship with Sarah by demolishing his relationship with the pregnant Hagar. "Do whatever you please," he tells his wife, and Sarah does. The Bible tells us that Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar. It's the same wording the Bible uses for the way the Egyptians treat their Jewish slaves in Exodus, meaning with oppression and forced labor. Abraham gave Sarah complete authority over Hagar, knowing what it would mean for the servant woman, and he stood by while Sarah abused the pregnant woman with impunity. It's impossible for us as modern listeners to dredge up any sympathy for Sarah at this point. But like the men of the Bible, the women of the Bible are complicated. They are, on the whole, neither fully good nor completely bad people, but simply people in all their messy and uncomfortable humanity. And it's when we can see them in their full humanity that God can teach us something about ourselves. The next time we hear from Sarah, she is once again skeptical of God's plan. In one of the Bible's most enigmatic stories, God appears to Abraham at his tent by the oaks of Mamre and tells him that Sarah will bear a son. The story is a strange one because the first verse of the chapter says that God appears to Abraham, but then the very next sentence says that 3 men stood before him. Genesis 18, 1-2. Whatever happened at Mamre, it is clear that this was a very unusual visit. And this time it wasn't just Abraham God had come to see. "Where is your wife Sarah?" the 3 men ask him. "There, in the tent," he says. Then one of them says, "I will surely return to you about this time next year. And Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Genesis 18, 9 and 10. This was a message for Sarah, loud and clear. When God appeared to Abraham before, he had told him that he would have a son of his body. This time, he was more explicit. It will be a son of Abraham's body and of Sarah's. She is central to this covenant narrative. She is an equal recipient of the promise. And it's almost as though God were saying, "Pay attention this time." Sarah did, and her reaction was immediate. She laughed. She left one of the most extraordinary reactions to a revelation from God, recorded in the Bible. However, don't forget, just one chapter earlier, Abraham was just as incredulous. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Genesis 17:17. At this point, Sarah was done with all revelations, all promises. She had seen enough. She had hoped long enough. She had tried long enough. No more. And so, when the big reveal came, she laughed it. "Tell me another," Sarah thought. And God took note. Why did Sarah laugh? Genesis 18:13, he asks. Is anything impossible with God? Genesis 18:14. We can imagine Abraham turned several vivid shades of purple with embarrassment during this exchange. Sarah hastily tries to fix it too. She denies laughing, but God responds, "No, you did laugh." Genesis 18:15. The climatic moment of God's revelation to Abraham has just become the world's most disastrous dinner party. We hear Sarah's voice in the text once more with the birth of Isaac, 9 months later. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God has promised him. Abraham gave him the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Genesis 21, 1-7. Sarah's laughter had been transformed, first into the name of the child, and then into joy. Was she also laughing at her own disbelief and the renewal of her faith through the miraculous event? The laughter that at first she attempted to deny has now become an object of commemoration in the very name of her son, Isaac, or in Hebrew, Yitzhak, in the Hebrew meaning laughter. But that laughter is no longer the snit or the snite, mocking laughter of disbelief. It is now the laughter of joy, and Sarah invites others to join in it with her. It is the laughter of the reverser of all expectations of resurrection, the hope of reborn to new life, and her son's name is a nod of the head to God. Her acknowledgement that not only was God right and she wrong, but that she too was included in the covenant, that she too was the recipient of promise. It would be wonderful to end the story of Sarah here, but that is not where Scripture leaves her. For Sarah's story is intertwined with Hagar's from beginning to end. From Sarah's first words in the text when she offers Hagar to Abraham, to her last words in the text, when she drives Hagar and Ishmael in the desert, far from feeling calmer and more confident in God and in herself after Isaac's birth. Sarah seems instead to be on high alert. When Isaac was 3 years old, the traditional age of waning, Genesis 21 tells us that Sarah saw his older brother Ishmael laughing. Some translations suggest mocking. The Bible doesn't tell us anything more than that. Something about what she saw triggered a fresh backflash by Sarah. Did she feel that Ishmael's presence made her son seem less special, less extraordinary? After all, wasn't Ishmael a son of Abraham too? And who was to say that in later years Ishmael might not grow jealous or full of hatred and threaten her beloved son? As we see again and again in the polygamous relationships the Bible documents, jealousy and division are almost always present among family members. Sarah says to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Genesis 21 verse 10. Did Sarah go too far this time in asking Abraham to end this relationship with his eldest son, to send him away so that he may never see him again? How could Sarah ask such a thing? But nothing is a surprise to God or a barrier to his plans, and he reassured Abraham. God didn't tell Abraham that Sarah was right, but he did tell him that Ishmael would be a great nation and under his protection. So, with that promise, perhaps Abraham felt confident that no harm would come to the boy or his mother and dad. In order to preserve peace in his family, it would be best to send him away. So, off into the desert, Hagar and Ishmael went, to a fate unknown to Sarah and Abraham. We do not hear Sarah's voice again, though other voices in Scripture refer to her. She is called the mother of promise, Romans 9 verse 9, and the mother of faith, Hebrew 11 verse 11, and Peter refers to her as the model wife, 1 Peter 3 verse 6. There is one great event recorded in the life of Abraham and Sarah. Before the narrative moves on to the next generation, God has a test in mind for Abraham. He asked him to take his one remaining child, the child of covenant and promise, his son Isaac, and offer him as a human sacrifice. It is hard for us to imagine being asked to do the same with our own beloved children. But do not forget what Abraham had already witnessed. God's unending faithfulness. He had already watched as God kept his promise, bringing a newborn baby to a 100-year-old man and his 90-year-old wife. Hebrews 11:19 gives us insight into what Abraham must have been thinking. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Because Abraham had already heard God's promises and seen them come to fruition, Hebrews is suggesting that Abraham believed that, even if he were called to sacrifice Isaac, God could bring him back to life. Did Abraham tell Sarah what he was doing? This is the great question. He didn't tell Isaac, which is understandable. Not only did he need the child's compliance, but he didn't want to frighten him. The story of Abraham trudging toward the spot where God had called him to sacrifice Isaac is a difficult one to read. We know now the end of the story, but in those hours of days, Abraham couldn't have known how things would unfold. Genesis 22:6 reveals his deep faith in the journey. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." He is stating his clear belief that the two will return together, despite what God is asking of him. Isaac must have been bewildered, even frightened at some point, as Abraham followed through, reaching for the very knife to slay his son. The angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Genesis 22, verse 10. And then, of course, the bleeding of the ram in the thicket quickly retrieved to become the sacrifice instead of Isaac. The high drama of it makes for an incomparable story, but Sarah saw none of it. All this happened out of her sight and perhaps her knowledge. If God had applied the same test to Sarah, what would she have done? From what we know of Sarah, it's hard to believe she would have saddled that donkey and taken her son to be sacrificed. It's hard to imagine any mother who has borne a child in her body saying yes to that. How does any of us react when our faith is put to test? Whether through periods of doubt and despair, the death of a loved one, infertility, or financial ruin. Often we ask to be willing to sacrifice what feels most precious to us. Do we? As Abraham did, proceed in faith or look for our own way out? Sarah, who longed so desperately for her own child, made a decision that forever altered history. And yet God chose her to be the human fulfillment of his covenant. With Abraham, the mother of Israel, the nation, Isaiah 51 verse 2. Again, despite our flaws, we can be used by our Heavenly Father to weave together his highest purpose. And Sarah is the perfect illustration of that beautiful, complex truth. So the next session, we're going to talk about Hagar, because otherwise it's going to be too long. I know it's a long session, but let it be an insight, a wisdom. How Sarah thought and reacted and lived her life, as Abraham lived, thought, and reacted, the responses, the relationship. How can we reflect on that as of today? So I hope you bear with me as we go for the next. I'm going to talk about Hagar. May the peace of God be with you and stays with you, and may his light shine upon you and keep you safe. Take joy to this new day, a day given to you, a day to reflect, a day to wonder, a day to receive new revelations. Go with God. This is your Pastor Yeti. Bye-bye.